Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me today as we examine some of the most significant developments shaping our nation right now. Over the next 50 minutes, I want to walk you through several critical stories that are not just making headlines, but are fundamentally challenging how we understand our legal system, our infrastructure, our economy, and our place in the world. Let me start with what may be the most constitutionally significant issue we're facing right now, and that's the potential Supreme Court case concerning birthright citizenship. For those who haven't been following this closely, we're looking at a direct challenge to the 14th Amendment, specifically the citizenship clause that has been the bedrock of American identity since 1868. The clause states very clearly that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Now, the question before us isn't just a legal technicality. This goes to the heart of who we are as a nation. The Trump administration appears poised to challenge the automatic granting of citizenship to children born on American soil when their parents are undocumented immigrants. The argument, and I want to present this fairly, is that the phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, creates a carve-out, an exception for children whose parents owe allegiance to another country. Let me explain why this matters so profoundly. We're talking about approximately 300,000 children born each year in the United States to undocumented parents. These are American babies, born in American hospitals, who under current constitutional interpretation are American citizens from their first breath. If the Supreme Court were to overturn or significantly narrow this interpretation, we would be creating a class of stateless children, individuals born on American soil who would have no automatic claim to citizenship anywhere. The possible outcomes here are stark. The Supreme Court could uphold existing precedent. The most relevant case, United States v. Wong Kim Ark from 1898, established that children born in the United States to foreign nationals are indeed citizens. The court could reaffirm this, essentially ending the debate. But given the current composition of the court, we have to consider that they might narrow the interpretation. They could rule that children born to parents who are in the country illegally are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States in the constitutional sense. The third possibility, and perhaps the most destabilizing, would be a complete overturning of the birthright citizenship principle as we've understood it. This would create immediate chaos. We would have millions of Americans, people who have lived their entire lives as citizens, who would suddenly find their status in question. Think about the administrative nightmare alone. How would we retroactively determine who qualifies for citizenship? Would we create a multi-tiered system where some people born here are citizens and others aren't based on their parents' immigration status? From a legal perspective, the conservatives on the court might argue for originalism, trying to divine what the framers of the 14th Amendment intended in 1868. The historical context matters here. That amendment was passed to overturn the Dred Scott decision and ensure that freed slaves and their descendants were recognized as full citizens. The question of immigration as we understand it today wasn't really the central concern. Opponents of birthright citizenship will argue that the framers never intended for it to apply to children of people who entered the country illegally, because the modern illegal immigration situation didn't exist in the same form. Progressive justices and scholars would counter that the text is clear and unambiguous. It says all persons born in the United States. Not some persons. Not persons whose parents have proper documentation. All persons. They would argue that creating exceptions based on parental status fundamentally undermines the equal protection principles that the 14th Amendment was designed to establish. The political implications here are enormous. If birthright citizenship is curtailed, we're looking at a fundamental reshaping of immigration policy and politics in this country. States with large immigrant populations would face incredible pressure. Would they create their own citizenship or residency programs? How would schools, hospitals, and social services treat children without citizenship? And what about the children themselves? Growing up without citizenship in the only country you've ever known creates a permanent underclass, which strikes at the very notion of American equality. Internationally, this would set the United States apart from most Western democracies, many of which practice birthright citizenship. It would signal a dramatic shift in how we view national identity and belonging. Countries around the world would be watching, some perhaps seeing this as validation for their own restrictive citizenship policies.
Now let me turn to some heartbreaking news from the world of architecture and design. Frank Gehry, one of the most influential architects of our time, has passed away. For those less familiar with architecture, Gehry was the creative force behind some of the most iconic buildings of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain. The Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles. The Dancing House in Prague. These weren't just buildings, they were sculptures, they were statements, they were arguments about what architecture could be. Gehry's death marks the end of an era in architectural philosophy. He was 96 years old, which means his career spanned an incredible period of change in how we build and conceive of space. What made Gehry revolutionary was his willingness to break from the rigid modernist tradition that dominated architecture for much of the 20th century. Where others saw straight lines and perfect angles, Gehry saw curves, undulations, buildings that seemed to move and breathe. His impact goes beyond aesthetics. Gehry proved that ambitious, sculptural architecture could revitalize entire cities. Before the Guggenheim Bilbao opened in 1997, Bilbao was a declining industrial city in northern Spain. The museum transformed it into a cultural destination, bringing in millions of tourists and billions in economic activity. This became known as the Bilbao effect, the idea that a single spectacular building could serve as a catalyst for urban renewal. But Gehry was also controversial, and I think it's important to acknowledge this. Critics accuse him of creating buildings that prioritized visual spectacle over functionality. Some argued that his designs were self-indulgent, more about the architect's ego than the needs of the people who would use the spaces. There were cost overruns on projects, complaints about maintenance difficulties, debates about whether his style had become too influential, spawning countless inferior imitations. Yet even his critics had to admit his influence. Gehry changed what was possible in architecture. He pioneered the use of computer-aided design in ways that allowed for shapes and structures that would have been impossible to build in earlier eras. He showed that architecture could be bold, personal, emotional, not just functional and efficient. His passing raises questions about the future of architecture. Will we see another figure who so thoroughly dominates and transforms the field? Or are we moving into an era of more collaborative, less individually driven design? As cities around the world face challenges of sustainability, affordability, and climate change, will there still be room for the kind of ambitious, expensive, sculptural architecture that Gehry championed? Let me shift now to an environmental crisis that isn't getting nearly enough attention, and that's the issue of boat strikes on marine life, particularly off the coasts of the United States. Recent data shows an alarming increase in collisions between vessels and whales, dolphins, sea turtles, and other marine species. We're not just talking about small boats. Large commercial vessels, including cargo ships and cruise ships, are responsible for a significant portion of these strikes. The numbers are sobering. Scientists estimate that boat strikes are one of the leading causes of death for several endangered whale species, including North Atlantic right whales, of which fewer than 350 individuals remain. Every single death matters for a population that's small. We're watching a species edge toward extinction, and human maritime activity is a major factor. Why is this happening?
Part of it is simple mathematics.
We have more boats on the water than ever before. Global shipping has increased dramatically. Recreational boating has grown. Whale-watching tourism, ironically, sometimes contributes to the problem. And many of these vessels are traveling through critical habitat areas, waters where whales feed, breed, and migrate. Speed is a crucial factor. A ship traveling at 10 knots or less has a much lower chance of striking a whale, and if a strike does occur, it's more likely to be survivable. But commercial shipping companies face economic pressure to move quickly. Time is money in the shipping industry, and slowing down adds costs. Some areas have implemented vessel speed restrictions, particularly during times when whales are most present. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has established seasonal speed rules in certain zones along the East Coast. But compliance is inconsistent, and enforcement is challenging. The ocean is vast, and monitoring every vessel's speed in real time is difficult and expensive. Technology offers some potential solutions. Some researchers are developing acoustic systems that can detect whale calls and alert nearby vessels. Others are working on artificial intelligence systems that can identify whales from aerial drones or satellites and predict where collisions are most likely to occur. There's also been discussion of creating marine highways, designated shipping lanes that avoid critical whale habitat. But here's the tension. Any solution that adds cost or time to shipping faces industry resistance. And in an era of online shopping, with consumer expectations of fast, cheap delivery, there's constant pressure to move goods more quickly. We're asking, essentially, whether we're willing to slow down our economy, even slightly, to protect marine life. The broader question is about how we share ocean space. As human use of the oceans intensifies, whether through shipping, offshore wind development, fishing, or recreation, we're increasingly competing with marine species for the same waters. Do we have a moral obligation to prioritize the survival of endangered species over economic efficiency? And if so, how do we enforce that obligation in international waters where regulations are harder to implement? There's also a cultural dimension here. Different societies have different relationships with marine life. Some cultures view whales and dolphins as sacred or as fellow beings deserving of protection. Others view them primarily as resources or obstacles to economic development. Finding international consensus on protection measures requires navigating these different worldviews. Now, moving to something that millions of Americans care deeply about, let's talk about soccer and the 2026 World Cup draw. For the first time, the United States will co-host a World Cup, along with Canada and Mexico. The draw has significant implications not just for Team USA, but for the entire tournament structure and the future of soccer in North America. Team USA's position in this draw determines their path through the tournament. A favorable draw could see them avoiding the strongest teams until later rounds, giving them a chance to build momentum and confidence. A difficult draw could mean facing powerhouses like Brazil, France, or Argentina early, which would be a tremendous challenge, but could also galvanize the team and capture public imagination. What makes this World Cup unique is its scale. It's expanding from 32 to 48 teams, which means more games, more venues, and a longer tournament. This expansion reflects soccer's growing global popularity, but it also raises questions about quality. Will including more teams dilute the competition, or will it give emerging soccer nations a chance to develop on the world stage? For the United States specifically, this World Cup represents a crucial moment for the sport domestically. Soccer has been growing in popularity, particularly among younger Americans, but it still hasn't achieved the cultural dominance of football, basketball, or baseball. A strong showing by Team USA, particularly if they can advance deep into the tournament, could accelerate soccer's growth and cement it as a major American sport. The economic impact will be substantial. Hosting World Cup matches brings enormous tourism revenue, infrastructure development, and global attention. Cities selected as host venues will see hotels filled, restaurants packed, and local businesses thriving.
But there are also costs.
Security for such a high-profile event is expensive and complex. Infrastructure upgrades are necessary. And there's always the question of whether the long-term benefits justify the short-term investment. From a sporting perspective, the home field advantage cannot be overstated. Playing in familiar stadiums, in front of supportive crowds, with no jet lag or long travel, gives Team USA a significant edge. The question is whether they can capitalize on it. The U.S. team is talented but inconsistent. They have players performing at high levels in European leagues, but they haven't yet shown the ability to compete consistently with the world's elite teams. The draw also affects Mexico and Canada, our co-hosts. Mexico has a proud soccer tradition and consistently qualifies for World Cups. They'll be looking to finally break through past the round of 16, a barrier they've struggled with for decades. Canada is less experienced on the world stage, but showed promise in recent years. For Canadian soccer, just being there and competing respectably could be considered a success. There's also a geopolitical element. Soccer is the world's game, and the World Cup brings together nations that might otherwise have tense relations. It's an opportunity for soft diplomacy, for cultural exchange, for reminding people that despite our differences, we can still compete fairly and celebrate athletic excellence together. In an increasingly fractured world, that matters. Let me transition now to immigration policy more broadly, because it connects to several of the topics we've discussed. The political debate around immigration has become increasingly polarized and, frankly, increasingly detached from practical realities. On one side, you have calls for completely open borders, for abolishing immigration and customs enforcement, for essentially treating national boundaries as irrelevant. On the other side, you have demands for mass deportations, for building walls, for treating all undocumented immigrants as criminals who should be removed immediately. The reality, as usual, is far more complex. The United States has approximately 11 million undocumented immigrants. These are people who live here, work here, pay taxes, in many cases have children here, have built lives here. The idea that we could simply round up 11 million people and deport them is not just morally questionable, it's logistically impossible and economically devastating. These individuals are integral to our agricultural sector, our construction industry, our service economy. Removing them would create labor shortages that would ripple through the entire economy. But at the same time, the argument for completely open borders ignores legitimate concerns about national security, about labor market impacts, about the strain on social services in communities experiencing rapid demographic change. Countries have a right, and arguably a responsibility, to control who enters and under what conditions. The question is how to do this humanely and practically. What we're seeing now is a failure of imagination and courage in our political class. Immigration reform has been discussed for decades, but comprehensive legislation never passes because both sides prefer to use the issue as a political weapon rather than actually solving it. Democrats can point to Republican obstruction and xenophobia. Republicans can point to Democratic weakness on border security. And meanwhile, millions of people live in legal limbo, unable to plan their futures or fully participate in American life. A rational immigration policy would acknowledge several things simultaneously. We need secure borders, yes. We need to know who is entering the country and why. But we also need robust legal immigration pathways that reflect actual labor market needs and humanitarian obligations. We need a pathway to citizenship, or at least permanent legal status, for people who have been here for years, who have established roots, who are essentially Americans in every way except documentation. And we need to address the root causes of migration, the violence, poverty, and instability in Central America and elsewhere that drives people to risk everything to come here. The birthright citizenship debate fits into this larger context. It's being presented as a solution to illegal immigration, the idea being that if children born here don't automatically become citizens, there's less incentive to come. But this logic is flawed. People don't undertake dangerous journeys and leave everything they know primarily to have anchor babies. They come for safety, for economic opportunity, to reunite with family. Eliminating birthright citizenship wouldn't significantly reduce immigration. It would just create a larger population of vulnerable, rightless people living in the shadows. Now, I want to touch on a story that might seem less nationally significant but reveals something important about our criminal justice system, and that's the recent jailbreak in Louisiana. Details are still emerging, but what we know is that multiple inmates escaped from a parish jail, raising serious questions about facility security and oversight. Jailbreaks, while rare, expose vulnerabilities in our incarceration system. How did this happen? Were there staff shortages? Inadequate training? Corruption? Aging infrastructure that wasn't properly maintained? Each of these possibilities points to broader problems in how we fund and operate correctional facilities. Parish jails in Louisiana and county jails across the country are often overlooked in discussions about criminal justice. People focus on state prisons and the federal system, but local jails house hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom haven't even been convicted of crimes. They're awaiting trial and can't afford bail. Conditions in these facilities are often worse than in prisons, precisely because they receive less oversight and attention. The escape also raises public safety concerns, obviously. When people who have been charged with crimes or are serving sentences get out, communities understandably feel anxious. Law enforcement has to dedicate resources to recapture them. And there are questions about liability. If someone escapes and commits another crime, who is responsible? The jail? The parish? The individual officers on duty? But let's dig deeper. Why do we have so many people in jails and prisons in the first place? The United States incarcerates a higher percentage of its population than any other country on Earth. We have roughly 5% of the world's population, but nearly 25% of its prisoners. This isn't because Americans are inherently more criminal. It's because of policy choices we've made about how to respond to crime, about mandatory minimum sentences, about the war on drugs, about cash bail systems that keep poor people locked up while wealthier defendants go free. Reform advocates argue that we need to dramatically reduce our incarcerated population. Many people in jails and prisons are there for nonviolent offenses, often drug-related. Keeping them locked up is expensive, it tears apart families and communities, and it doesn't make us safer. The money spent on incarceration could be redirected to education, mental health services, addiction treatment, all of which would more effectively prevent crime. Opponents of reform worry that reducing incarceration means being soft on crime, that it will lead to increased victimization and public disorder. They point to recent increases in certain types of crime in some cities and argue that we need more enforcement, not less. This debate often lacks nuance. It's possible to believe that some people need to be incarcerated for public safety, while also believing that we incarcerate far too many people for far too long. It's possible to support police and want safe communities, while also acknowledging that our criminal justice system has serious racial disparities and often fails to rehabilitate or provide justice. Finally, let me address something that affects almost everyone listening, and that's the impact of artificial intelligence on employment. New studies and reports are emerging almost weekly about how AI will transform the job market. Some predict massive unemployment as AI systems replace human workers in everything from customer service to legal research to medical diagnosis. Others are more optimistic, arguing that AI will create new jobs and make existing jobs more productive and fulfilling. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but the transition will be disruptive, and we're not prepared for it. Let me give you some specifics. AI is already being used to screen job applications, eliminating human HR professionals from the initial hiring process. It's being used to generate marketing copy, potentially displacing copywriters. It's analyzing legal documents, reducing the need for paralegals and junior associates. It's reading medical scans, possibly reducing demand for radiologists. These aren't hypothetical future scenarios. This is happening now. And the pace of development is accelerating. The AI systems available today are significantly more capable than those from just 2 years ago. Extrapolate that forward, and it's clear that many jobs that seem secure today will be threatened within a decade. The question is how we respond. Do we try to slow down AI development to give workers time to adjust? Do we invest heavily in retraining programs? Do we consider more radical solutions like universal basic income, recognizing that if AI is generating enormous wealth while eliminating jobs, we need new ways to distribute that wealth? History provides some guidance. Previous waves of automation eliminated certain jobs, but created others. The automobile replaced horse-drawn carriages, putting blacksmiths and stable operators out of work, but creating jobs in car manufacturing, road construction, gas stations, and countless related industries. The computer revolution eliminated some clerical jobs but created entire new sectors of the economy. But there are reasons to think AI might be different. Previous automation mostly replaced physical labor or routine cognitive tasks. AI is increasingly capable of handling non-routine cognitive work, the kind of creative and analytical thinking that has traditionally been the domain of highly educated professionals. If AI can write, reason, create, and analyze as well as or better than humans, what jobs remain exclusively human? Some argue that uniquely human skills like emotional intelligence, creativity, and complex interpersonal interaction will remain valuable. But even these are being challenged. AI is getting better at understanding emotion, at generating creative content, at personalizing interactions. It might not fully replace humans in these domains, but it could reduce the number of humans needed. The economic implications are profound. If AI dramatically increases productivity but eliminates jobs, we could see a scenario where companies are enormously profitable while large segments of the population struggle to find work. This would exacerbate already severe wealth inequality and could lead to social instability. We're going to need new social contracts, new ways of thinking about work, value, and human purpose. If people can't earn a living through traditional employment, how do they support themselves? How do we maintain dignity and purpose in a world where your economic contribution might not be needed? These aren't just economic questions, they're philosophical and existential ones. As I bring this to a close, I want to step back and look at what connects these seemingly disparate stories. What ties together birthright citizenship, Frank Gehry's death, boat strikes on whales, the World Cup draw, immigration policy, a jailbreak in Louisiana, and AI's impact on jobs? I would argue that all of these stories are about how we navigate change, how we balance competing values, and how we decide what kind of society we want to be. The birthright citizenship debate is about whether we define American identity expansively or restrictively. Gehry's legacy is about whether we value bold vision, even when it's imperfect. The boat strike issue is about whether we prioritize economic efficiency or environmental stewardship. The World Cup is about whether we can find common purpose across national boundaries. Immigration policy is about how we treat vulnerable people seeking better lives. The jailbreak exposes how we've chosen to deal with crime and punishment. And AI forces us to reconsider the relationship between work, identity, and human worth. None of these issues have simple solutions. Anyone offering simple solutions is either naive or trying to sell you something. What we need instead is the humility to acknowledge complexity, the empathy to consider different perspectives, and the courage to make difficult choices even when they're politically costly. We live in a moment of tremendous possibility and tremendous risk. The decisions we make now about citizenship, about the environment, about technology, about justice, will shape not just our lives but the lives of generations to come. We can choose to be fearful and reactive, building walls and clinging to familiar certainties. Or we can be thoughtful and proactive, embracing change while staying true to core values of human dignity, justice, and shared flourishing. I don't pretend to have all the answers. But I do know that we need to engage with these questions seriously and honestly. We need to listen to each other, even when we disagree profoundly. We need to base our decisions on evidence and reason, not just emotion and ideology. And we need to remember that we're all in this together, that the challenges we face don't respect partisan divides or national boundaries. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope this has given you some food for thought as you navigate these complex and consequential times. The future is unwritten, and we all have a role in shaping it. Let's make sure we're thoughtful about the choices we make and the values we prioritize. Thank you.